Hello, my name is Gareth Russell. It is a particularly grey morning in Belfast when I'm recording this as part of a series of very rough and ready, rough around the edges, converted presentations into videos and narrations that I've been doing during lockdown in the hope that some of the history I've worked on will maybe entertain or distract people during this quite difficult time for everyone. One of my books is called A History of the English Monarchy from Boadicea to Elizabeth I. And in today's video, I will be narrating a sort of edited version of one of the chapters in that to give us an overview of the life of one of England's earlier kings, and certainly one of her most famous, although I think his name is famous because of the conquest of 1066, which is, I think, sometimes in English history almost seen, rightly or wrongly, as a year zero. But I think his personality is often overlooked, and so I hope this entertains and informs. Conqueror and Bastard, the life of William of Normandy, King of England. William I ruled England as its king from 1066 until 1087, a 21-year period that for many marked one of the most significant turning points in European history. Known variably as William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, he was a man forged in the fires of a brutal and merciless generation. Even by the undemanding standards of the 11th century, William the Bastard stood out as a man to be feared, or, as he would have seen it, respected. He was dragged to maturity in a world that possessed all the security of quicksand, cared for, if you can call it that, with companions that might have made a seasoned mafioso blush. As his least flattering sobriquet suggests, William was born out of wedlock as the illegitimate son of Robert the Magnificent, Viking descended Duke of Normandy, and his mistress, Herleva of Falaise. Herleva's origins are disputed, with some claiming that she was the daughter of a tanner, a skinner of animals, or a town official. Either way, she was not a member of the nobility, and William remained touchy about both his own birth out of wedlock and his mother's ancestry. In the 11th century, both were seen as rendering William of slightly defective stock. No matter how brutally unkind that might seem to us today, that was how it worked in the 1000s. During a military campaign, when the townsfolk of Alençon pelted William's army with animal skins as a mean-spirited joke about Herleva's family, William responded by lopping off their hands and feet once he took the city. His father Robert died when William was 7, leaving his bastard son to inherit a region notorious for its quarrelsome nobility. Duke William's youth meant that whoever controlled his person also controlled the reins of power, a recurring problem for medieval monarchies, since the actual well-being and happiness of the prince was usually far down the list of their guardians' priorities. In William's case, the instability and greed he was exposed to at such a young age seems to have permanently warped his character. When one considers the things he saw, it is easy to see why. In one grisly incident, William's protector had his throat slit by a rival as he slept in a chateau at Vaudreuil, in the same bedroom as a slumbering William. So William learned early that power lay at the edge of the sharpest sword wielded by the strongest man. Insubordination was not to be tolerated. Open defiance was to be punished efficiently and viciously. Freeing himself from the fetters of his guardians, William scored his first major military victory at the Battle of Val-Edouard, aged 19. By 1052, he had married Matilda of Flanders, a very beautiful and noble girl of royal stock, according to one contemporary, and her father ruled the neighbouring province of Flanders. A diminutive woman with an impeccable bloodline who counted the King and Queen of France as her grandparents, and who could trace her ancestry easily back to the great Christian Emperor Charlemagne, chroniclers said that Matilda was even more distinguished for the purity of her mind and manners than for her illustrious lineage. She united beauty with gentle breeding and all the graces of Christian holiness. Matilda's royal pedigree helped cancel out the stigma that came from William's mother, and apart from the politically useful alliance with Flanders, the new Duchess added a respectability to William's rule that had previously been lacking. Children arrived in the ducal nursery: Robert, the heir, followed by his brothers Richard and William, and by their sisters Agatha, Adelicia, Cecilia, Matilda, and Constance. This progeny guaranteed the succession, further stabilizing William's rule. His power grew further when his only two significant rivals in the region, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, nicknamed Geoffrey the Hammer, and King Henri I of France, died, to be respectively succeeded by Geoffrey's incompetent nephew and Henri's 8-year-old son. Without anyone there to check him, William conquered the county of Maine in 1062 on the pretext that its previous ruler had nominated him as his rightful heir before dying. It was not the last time he employed that justification. In 1064, an important, if unexpected, guest arrived at William and Matilda's court: Harold, Earl of Wessex. One of the most powerful noblemen from England, Harold had been shipwrecked in the English Channel and then taken prisoner by the Count of Ponthieu. Ponthieu intended to ransom Harold for an enormous sum, but before he could do so, William turned up on his doorstep and demanded that he hand Harold over. William the Bastard was not a man one refused lightly, and so the Count of Ponthieu wisely bent the knee. Harold of Wessex was taken back to Normandy by his apparent liberator, where he was treated to the lavish hospitality organised by the charming Matilda of Flanders. But as Matilda charmed Harold, William leaned on him. His liberation from Ponthieu had not come gratis. William and Harold were already rivals over the issue of succession to the English throne. Both had marital ties to the English royal house, which put them as contenders to succeed the childless and pious King Edward the Confessor when he died. There were two other contenders: a young prince, Edgar the Atheling, and the fearsome King of Norway. William intended to succeed Edward as king in England, and he wanted Harold to relinquish his own claim, significant as he was the only adult English native nobleman in the race, to support William's when the time came for saintly Edward to shuffle off the mortal coil. No matter how comfortable his stay in Normandy was, Harold knew that he would never see home again if he did not agree to renounce his claim to the English throne in order to support William's. It's at this point, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman versions of events diverge. According to Harold, he submitted to William's conditions under duress, while William claimed that Harold not only swore, but he did so while his hand was on holy relics. If you believed Harold, then the oath he pledged in Normandy hardly merited the name. However, if you believed William, then Harold had entered into a contract with God, and the presence of the relics made breaking that promise akin to blasphemy. Both parties appeared satisfied at the time, with Harold even agreeing to give up his common law wife, the gloriously named Edith Swanneck, to marry one of William's younger daughters once she came of age. Harold was allowed to sail home to England, and in hindsight, it does seem unlikely that a man as canny as William would not have incorporated something binding like holy relics when extracting an oath as important as the one he elicited from Harold. Letting him go home suggests confidence in his loyalty. By 1065, William the Bastard had been Duke of Normandy for 30 years. He was about 37 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, with cropped hair, a clean shaven face, and he was fastidious about personal hygiene. He had successfully suppressed all challenges to his rule and significantly expanded his family's influence. Norman towns like Rouen, Caen, and Bayeux were growing. The region's economy was healthy, thanks in part to the industry of Jewish settlers permitted in its towns and the money yielded by Normandy's excellent vineyards. William and Matilda were sufficiently wealthy to devote a substantial amount of their resources to the building of monasteries, nunneries, and churches, as was expected of successful medieval rulers. Then, in January 1066, William received the news from England that King Edward the Confessor had died, and Harold, Earl of Wessex, had reneged on his promise to help William succeed to the English throne. Harold had become king after Edward. Almost immediately, Norman preparations began for an invasion of Harold's new kingdom. Even the gentle Duchess Matilda seemed incensed, and personally paid for a new warship, the Mora, to speed her husband's army across the Channel. It took the best part of a year to prepare the soldiers, the fleet, and them to wait for good weather. A papal blessing for the Norman war effort came from Pope Alexander II. William, good and faithful servant to His Holiness, promised to bring the ecclesiastical reform initiatives of the 11th century across the Channel with his armies. The Anglo-Saxon branch of the Catholic Church had always retained a certain independent flair, and a particular bugbear of the papacy's was the news that the so-called Danish marriages were still being tolerated in England, a sort of common law or secular marriage that did not feel a priest was necessary to solemnize a union. When William set sail for England, he left Matilda behind as his regent, a tribute both to her capabilities and William's confidence in them. Before William set foot in England, another of the four claimants to the throne had landed in the north of the country. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, came with 300 ships and the treacherous support of King Harold's duplicitous brother Tostig. Together, they scored an early victory in the Battle of Gate Fulford, where they defeated and killed two of the English king's most loyal supporters, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. King Harold swept north to retaliate, and the two armies clashed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 20th. King Harald Hardrada and Tostig were both killed in combat, and the Norwegians fled home, having sustained such heavy casualties that they only filled 24 of their original 300 ships. Stamford Bridge was a testament to King Harold II's skill as a warrior and the seriousness with which he took the task of defending his newly won throne. However, he was also facing several problems that fatally weakened his ability to respond to the second invasion of that autumn, William's. The first was a question of energy. His men were understandably exhausted from the swift march northwards for their subsequent battle with the Norwegians. Now King Harold expected them to march with equal speed to the southern end of the kingdom to score another victory against another large, well-trained foreign army. Secondly, the size of Harold's army had been reduced. He had no choice but to release thousands of soldiers known as the Feared, because they were farmers who could legally be temporarily co opted into royal military service, but who had to be allowed to go home again in time for the harvest. Harold could not, or would not, face the chance of famine or hunger if the crops were not properly collected, and his army thus shrank significantly between Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Tired, and with far fewer men, the king marched south to face William. As soon as the Normans arrived in England, they lived up to their dire reputation as latter day Vikings. William had the area around him scorched, ruining the common people's livelihoods and forcing King Harold to hurry into battle. It was actually in the English king's interests to avoid open battle for as long as possible. William had destroyed the countryside, limiting his own access to resources and food supplies. If Harold waited in the north or even in London, he could reasonably hope to starve the Normans out and to allow dissatisfaction through malnourishment to undermine William's army. But instead, and under pressure, King Harold rushed towards his ruin. Perhaps he was panicked by reports of William's cruelty in southern England and he wanted it to end. Maybe he was buoyed up by his victory against Harald Hardrada and hoped he could do the same thing again. Whatever the reason, and like most things in history, it is likely to have been a combination. Harold II and his army arrived, exhausted by their travels, in southern England on October 14th, 1066. Initially, it looked like Harold II was about to win a second victory despite his difficulties. An assault by the Norman infantry was rebuffed by the English shields. A later charge by the cavalry saw William himself unhorsed and momentarily presumed dead. In the ensuing confusion, the Normans appeared to retreat, and the English broke rank, and thus their wall of shields, to pursue them. As they chased, the Normans suddenly rounded on the English in what looked suspiciously like a premeditated ambush. Pathetic fallacy played its part, as King Harold and his entourage were seen charging into the sunset to face an archery attack that included the arrow that allegedly pierced King Harold's eye. There has been some debate about whether Harold's eye was pierced by the arrow, but incredibly, both the Bayeux Tapestry, the great artistic tribute to the Norman victory, and a later chronicler, Henry of Huntingdon, confirmed the story that Harold was wounded by an arrow in the eye or near it, and that he kept fighting even after his horrific injury, and it was only when he was ridden down and hacked to pieces that he finally died. Most of his companions perished alongside him, either from the arrows or the swords of the Norman cavalry. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a monastic history bitterly hostile to the Normans, wrote later, "The king fought very hard against him with those men who wanted to support him, and there was great slaughter on either side. There was killed King Harold, and Earl Leofwine his brother, and Earl Gareth his brother, and many good men, and the French had possession of the place of slaughter." Another chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, was more poetic, calling the Battle of Hastings a scene of destruction so terrible that it must have moved any beholder to pity the mangled bodies that had been the flower of the English nobility and youth, which covered the ground as far as the eye could see. Tradition has it that Harold II's body was eventually identified by his beautiful companion Edith Swanneck, who waded through the dead to find the king's mutilated corpse by identifying marks on his chest known only to her. It was apparently thanks to Edith's efforts that the dead monarch's body was found and taken to nearby Waltham Abbey to receive a decent Christian burial. A later pro-Norman version of events had William chivalrously honouring his dead foe by having Harold buried near to the seashore, which in life he did defend so long. but that seems unlikely, not least because Harold was buried miles inland. From the place of slaughter, a triumphant William proceeded to London, where he repeated the tactic of laying waste to the kingdom by fire and sword until the civic leaders of the city came outside its walls to participate in a humiliating ceremony of surrender. A king was supposed to protect his subjects from harm, and particularly from unfair destruction of their property unless they had rebelled against him, but William was intent upon terrorizing on arrival. Until his coronation, he maintained the legal fiction that a publicum bellum, or state of war, still existed between Normandy and England, enabling him and his knights to behave as marauding invaders until it ceased. On Christmas Day, he was crowned in Westminster Abbey as England's new great and peace-giving king, who is crowned by God, life, and victory. As William's virtues as a peace-giving monarch were proclaimed inside the abbey, outside it local homes were being burned to the ground by the new king's ham-fisted soldiers, who thought the crowd's cheers sounded suspiciously like protest and decided to punish before asking any questions. So, as the sounds of the screaming, burning, panicking, and then rioting reached the coronation ceremony within the abbey, it was said that William displayed a rare moment of public weakness, trembling from head to toe as the bishops rushed through the task of anointing him. True to form, he recovered his nerve quickly. His wife Matilda and their now royal children were brought over to England, where Matilda received her own coronation as Queen Consort in the summer of 1068. Two more royal children were born to the couple in England, Henry and Adele. Matilda of Flanders had maintained a close relationship with many segments of the Jewish community in Normandy, and it has fascinatingly been suggested that Judaism in England can trace its origins to those Jews who migrated to England under the protection of Queen Matilda in the 1060s. Prince Edgar the Atheling was now the last of William's three royal counter-claimants still left alive. Having the measure of William, the young prince, his mother, and his two sisters fled north to seek asylum at the court of Scotland's King Malcolm III, whom readers of Shakespeare may recognise as the victorious prince at the end of Macbeth. The family's safety from William's clutches was soon guaranteed when Edgar's eldest sister, Princess Margaret of Wessex, caught the eye of their protector and became Queen of Scots by marriage. The pious princess had initially dreamed of becoming a nun, but King Malcolm's persistence and, no doubt, a trace of pragmatic familial pressure reconciled her to the idea of marriage. Edward the Confessor's widow, the Dowager Queen Edith, managed to save her fortune by testifying that William was her husband's true and preferred heir, while King Harold's bereaved Edith Swanneck led dozens of well-born Anglo-Saxon girls, widows, and heiresses seeking to avoid rape and then forced marriages with the invaders by seeking sanctuary behind convent walls. Not all of the old elite went so quietly, nor did the ordinary people of England look upon the invasion kindly. There were numerous rebellions against Norman rule, most of which were punished with the mass blinding or mutilation of their leaders. The most serious of these uprisings captured York, the premier city in the north, where they proclaimed the exiled Edgar the Atheling to be the rightful King of England, and wrote to Denmark inviting them to invade. William paid the Danish forces off, and his gold evidently weighed more than their scruples. The Danes returned home, abandoning the Northerners to their fate. Even by William the Conqueror's standards, it proved to be a harrowing one, retrospectively referred to as the harrying of the North. The Anglo-Norman monk Orderic Vitalis, whose family was among the thousands victimized by the harrying, recalled that to William's lasting disgrace he yielded to his worst impulse and set no bounds to his fury, condemning the innocent and the guilty to die by slow starvation. The king burned most of York to the ground, ordered every adult male in the region to be executed, and had all the crops, fields, and harbours in the surrounding area torched. Like the after effects of a nuclear bomb, those who did not perish in the immediate slaughter were left to die from the consequences, as plague and starvation swept the north, helped along by the piles of unburied, rotting cadavers, ruined crops, and lack of shelter. William the Conqueror's actions were so depraved in their viciousness that a century later Yorkshire had still not recovered in terms of agriculture, economy, or population. So many insurrections over the course of 5 years unsettled the new king. In the remaining years of his reign, dozens of castles were built across the country to intimidate the populace, beginning with the makeshift motte baileys that bought time until their more permanent replacements could be raised in stone. The judicial system was manipulated to discriminate against the old aristocracy in favour of the new, to the extent that the Anglo-Saxon nobility as a class had all but ceased to exist by the end of William's life. Their titles and their estates were handed over to William's followers, who, speaking French and hiding behind stone walls, formed a new and alien ruling class, indifferent to and generally loathed by the native population. The minor nobility, the landowners of small or medium-sized estates, fared slightly better, but only just. Some were able to buy back their family estates at extortionate rates set by the Normans, or they found some kind of security in serving the new elite as their feudal dependents. Taxation records from the final year of William's time as king reveal that of all the substantial landowners in England, only two of them were actually English. One monk expressed the national unhappiness when he wrote, "It was a time when foreigners grew wealthy with the spoils of England, whilst her own sons were either shamefully slain or driven as exiles to wander helplessly through foreign kingdoms." A slightly tangential side note, I would just like to point out that I'm sort of recording this at home during lockdown, and neighbourhood children are playing, and if you hear yelps of delight, passing cars, the quarrels of children, uh, put it down to the lockdown logo. I hope it's not too loud or too distracting. Anyway, the post-conquest church was treated much as the aristocracy was, with the promotion of Normans, with the goal of the eradication of the native English from positions of authority. King William's spiritual advisor, Lanfranc, was installed as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, in which capacity he quickly made good on his master's promise to bring the recent papal reforms to the English branch of the Catholic Church. The historian Frank Barlow has, I think fairly, called the 11th century perhaps one of the most religious periods of all time, and William the Conqueror, with his scrupulous attendance of Mass and interest in reform of the Church, won plaudits from Pope Gregory VII, who was normally convinced that royal rulers were more hindrance than help when it came to safeguarding Holy Mother Church. Celibacy as a job requirement for Christian priests was a relatively new ecclesiastical innovation, and the English branch of the Catholic faith had resisted it for as long as they could. Under King William and Archbishop Lanfranc, it became mandatory. Lanfranc, gifted, energetic, devout, also protected monasticism, tackled financial corruption in the church hierarchy, and oversaw a massive architectural regeneration of the country's churches. Lanfranc had less success in persuading the English to abandon their aforementioned secular form of marriage, which seems to have persisted in certain parts of the country for at least the next 150 years. He also presided over the systematic eviction of English men from any significant positions of authority within the church, until by 1096 there was not a single bishopric or abbey in England that was under the control of someone who was ethnically English. So the legacy of the conquest's ecclesiastical policy is certainly more nuanced than its legacy with the nobility or with the wider population, but it was no less thorough in asserting Norman interests over England's. While the English were being reduced to living as second class citizens in their own country, if that, William faced problems from within his own family. His second son, Richard, Duke of Bernay, was killed in a hunting accident, to the great grief of Queen Matilda, who was a devoted mother. Matilda's maternal instincts were further put to the test when their eldest boy, Robert, rebelled against his father in an almighty strop after he felt he was not being given enough share in the government of Normandy, which he was one day due to inherit. As with so many medieval royal quarrels, this family squabble unfortunately soon took on all the characteristics of a civil war, as Robert treacherously fled to seek help from his father's foe, the King of France. When attempts to heal the rift between father and son broke down, Queen Matilda, we are told, was choked by tears and could not speak. Despite her previous devotion to her husband's interests, the Queen apparently could not bear the thought of her firstborn being cut off, and she secretly used one of her servants, a man from Brittany called Samson, to deliver money to the exiled Robert. When King William discovered what she had done, he furiously threatened to have her servant Samson blinded. Queen Matilda begged for mercy on her servant's behalf, and William eventually relented to her. He permitted Samson, eyes intact, to retire to a monastery, taking the cowl as penitence for aiding a traitor. Defending her actions towards the son that everyone but her seemed to regard as an entitled, spineless nuisance, Queen Matilda allegedly told her husband, "O my lord, do not wonder that I love my firstborn with such tender affection. By the power of the Most High, if my son Robert were dead and buried 7 feet into the earth, and I could bring him back to life with my own blood, I would shed my lifeblood for him." The sting of Robert's rebellion was supplemented when the king's half brother Odo also betrayed him. The details of Odo's particular treachery are now lost to us, but he had once been William's right hand. Whatever Odo did or tried to do, it must have been serious to result in the loss of royal favour, and then in 7 years' imprisonment. Odo was not just Earl of Kent, one of the chief recipients of the Conquest's decimation of the English aristocracy, but he was also Bishop of the Norman Episcopacy of Bayeux. He was, to put it mildly, an unconventional prelate, best remembered for the colourful tale that he used to ride into battle with an enormous club in order to avoid disobeying Christ's command that his apostles should not spill blood by the sword. So His Grace the Bishop of Bayeux apparently went through his life gleefully clubbing people to death, and eventually betraying his royal brother. William quailed at the thought of arresting a priest before Archbishop Lanfranc told him to arrest Odo in his capacity as an earl rather than as a bishop, a convenient loophole that soothed the royal conscience. The final years of the Conqueror's reign saw him grow corpulent and lose much of his hair. The Queen died in 1083, and she was buried in an abbey she had founded in Normandy, where her eldest daughter Cecilia was the abbess. William had stayed by his wife's side during her final illness, and he did not remarry. Without Matilda's mediation, the king's relationship with his eldest son Robert deteriorated further. In England, the Conqueror's government introduced the famous Domesday Book, a meticulous recording of the wealth, land, and property of all William's subjects, for which historians remain eternally grateful, and for which his contemporary subjects roundly cursed him. because the survey enabled higher, more efficient levels of taxation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was particularly snippy about the Great Survey's avaricious attention to detail when it wrote, "So very thoroughly did he have the inquiry carried out that there was not a single hide, not one vigret of land, not even, it is shameful to record it, but it did not seem shameful for him to do it, not even one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig which escaped notice in his survey." And all surveys were subsequently brought to him. It is shameful to record it, but it did not seem shameful for him to do it is one of my favourite historical put-downs. In the summer of 1087, William went campaigning against King Philippe the Amorous of France. As his armies were laying waste to the city of Mantes, the Conqueror rode through the destruction, urging his soldiers to further acts of violence. But Mantes was to be the last city he destroyed. His horse stumbled on a burning ember, and the king was thrown violently against the iron pommel of his saddle. A mortal injury was sustained, and William's attendants rushed him back to his castle in Rouen. As life ebbed out of him at an excruciating pace, the Conqueror's two youngest sons, William and Henry, joined him. William seems to have been his father's favourite, and while it was unwise to contemplate fully disinheriting his firstborn, the disgraced Robert, it was William who was to inherit the throne of England while Robert would get Normandy. The youngest of the princes, Henry, in a magnificent example of not reading the room, wept bitterly in front of his dying father and loudly complained that he was inheriting nothing. This was not exactly true. Henry had already inherited all of his mother's estates in England, and the Conqueror planned to leave his youngest the enormous sum of £5,000 in silver. Still, for a man who wanted power, money with no land proved a bitter pill to swallow. The younger William, meanwhile, left his father's deathbed with a parting letter for Archbishop Lanfranc, commanding him to place the crown of England on the prince's head. With his affairs seemingly in order, King William asked to be moved from the castle. The sounds from the town streets were too noisy, and he wished to die in peace, the way he had denied so many thousands of others. His servants obediently carried him to the priory of Saint-Gervais, a picturesque little monastery overlooking Rouen from a hill outside its western walls. And I would like to take a moment to congratulate myself, as this is the 7th take after I failed to pronounce the word obediently correctly, for reasons best unknown to myself, in the previous 6 takes of this. Anyway, moving on. There, in a monk's cell, William the Conqueror began to reflect aloud on the extraordinary journey that had taken him from bastard boy to one of the most feared leaders in Christendom. His final musings were so long and eloquent that later writers suspected embellishment. It's certainly possible, but equally possible, I think, that this culture of loquacious deathbed testimonials was in fact self-perpetuating. By extolling their virtue in art and chronicles, the writers of the medieval period actually created a mentality in which men and women began to imitate art in life. Certainly, I would say the chroniclers edited out the blood, the guts, the stench, the hesitations, the deathbed vomiting. But we need not be so cynical as to believe they made the whole thing up, or that human beings are not capable of fine speeches, even in extremis. William lived through the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The next day he was woken by the sound of church bells summoning the faithful to morning prayers. His last words, apparently, were, "I commend my soul to the Holy Mary, Mother of God, that by her prayers she may reconcile me with her Son, our Lord Jesus Christ." Fearful of retribution from his many enemies, William's servants fled, abandoning his corpse as panic swept the streets of Rouen. It was left to the local archbishop to calm the situation by processing out to Saint-Gervais to take possession of the dead king's body and to make arrangements for his funeral. His remains lay in St Etienne's, a monastery he had founded in Normandy, until France's 16th century wars of religion, when, in a burst of Protestant iconoclasm, the monastery was attacked in the alleged onslaught against idolatry, and the Conqueror's sarcophagus was destroyed along with numerous works of Christian art. The only part of his body ever recovered was his thigh bone, which was reinterred at St Etienne's beneath a new tombstone in 1987, 9 centuries after his death. I'd like to thank you for your time in listening to this. I hope it was of some interest. And also, really, to send you my very best wishes to you and yours if you're listening to this during the COVID-19 lockdown.